Hello, and thank you all so much for attending this Manhattan Institute virtual panel discussion. My name is Rafael Mangual. I am the Nick O'Neill Fellow and contributing editor at City Journal here at MI, where I work primarily on the Policing and Public Safety Initiative. Our topic for today's event is the case of Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely, which has really gripped and sharply divided New Yorkers from the very first news accounts of the events that led up to Jordan Neely's death. Joining me for this discussion today are three amazing women who I'll briefly introduce before we get started. First, we have Joan Aluzzi Orban, who is a fellow here at the Manhattan Institute and a veteran of the Manhattan DA's office, where she has tried countless high-profile felony cases over a 33-year career as a prosecutor. We're also joined by Nicole Gelinas, who is a senior fellow here at MI. Her journalism has really made her a staple in New York City policy circles. And she was actually in the courtroom every day to cover the trial for City Journal, where she is also a contributing editor. And last but certainly not least is Olivia Reingold, a journalist for the Free Press, for whom she's done fantastic work covering the Daniel Penny case from inside the courtroom. So with intros out of the way, I want to welcome our guests. And before we get started, I'm just going to briefly set the stage for our conversation here before I turn to our distinguished panelists. And I think the best place to start with is just a quick recount of what happened in this case, because it really starts a little over a year ago on May 1st, 2023, when a 24-year-old college student and Marine Corps veteran named Daniel Penny boarded a Manhattan-bound F train in Brooklyn. Now, Penny was on his way to the gym, and a few stops into his ride, another man, Jordan Neely, walked onto the same subway car. He was, we later learned, high on K2, a synthetic marijuana. He was in the midst of a schizophrenic break, and he was also wanted on a warrant related to another case involving an assault on the subway, a case that accounted for one of 42 prior arrests. Now, according to the accounts of those who were on the train that day, Neely boarded the train in an irate state. He angrily threw his jacket aside and began ranting and raving as he paced up and down the train car, threatening other passengers, saying things like, "I'm ready to go to jail and someone is going to die." There were many others in that train car, people from all walks of life, women, children, people of different races and socioeconomic backgrounds. And nearly all of them seemed to have felt threatened by Neely's menacing conduct. And among those in fear was a mother and child that Neely was approaching. And that was when Daniel Penny decided that he should do something. And that something was to grab a hold of Neely from behind with one arm around his neck, take him to the ground and restrain him until police could come at the next station. And as they struggled on the ground, Penny seemed to apply and release the pressure on Neely's neck, depending on how hard Neely was fighting. And as minutes went by, passengers awaited the police that they had called to the scene. Now, before police could arrive, Penny was made aware by a man who had assisted him in restraining Neely that Neely had lost consciousness, at which point Penny seemed to release Neely, who was later pronounced dead. Now, I think it's important to be explicit about this. I want to just say that I think that Neely's death is an absolute tragedy. It really is. But I also think that Penny's assessment of Neely as a threat was reasonable, that his decision to restrain Neely was reasonable, and that his method of restraint was reasonable under the circumstances. So like a lot of Americans, I had a hard time personally seeing how you could listen to and watch the accounts of what took place and sort of come away believing that Daniel Penny was a criminal who should face up to 15 years in prison. And yet the Manhattan DA came to a different conclusion. And so with that, I think the best place to start here is with Joan. And Joan, I mean, you are a veteran prosecutor, and I think you're in the best position to really give us a quick rundown of exactly what the legal argument was here for Alvin Bragg's office in terms of advancing this case. What was Penny charged with, and what was the prosecution's theory of guilt here?
So let me start, Ralph, with saying that I can't opine about whether I agree or disagree. I can only explain to you what I assume that they were thinking in analyzing this case and deciding to indict Mr. Penny. And the first thing was that he was a trained military person. So I think that in a lot of ways, the Manhattan DA's office attributed to him knowledge that would be perhaps beyond the ordinary person with regards to how he was going to restrain this man and for how long. I also think that although everyone may agree that his initial confrontation with Mr. Neely and restraining Mr. Neely in the way he did was something that was life-saving and very, very important for the people who were petrified of this man. But the question I believe it came down to was the amount of restraint and for how long. And at what point did Mr. Penny realize or should have realized that his actions were going to then cause the death of another human being? And the Manhattan DA's office obviously came to a conclusion that Mr. Penny was guilty of either manslaughter in the first degree or criminal negligent homicide. And I'd like to very briefly explain those. So manslaughter in the first degree means that you you intentionally try to cause someone serious physical injury, not to kill them, but to cause them serious physical injury and they die. And criminally negligent homicide means that you engage in blameworthy conduct, which which creates a risk that somebody will die and that you were not conscious of that risk, but not being aware of the risk, not being cognizant of the risk that you were causing was not reasonable under the circumstance. So I'll give you a simple example. Let's say somebody's precariously has a crane on the top of a building and it's positioned in a way where it could possibly fall over and strike somebody on the ground below them, and that the technician thinks, it's okay, it should hold up, but not realizing, but should have realized in their position, that reasonable person would have, that the crane was positioned in such a way that it was likely to fall, causing the death of somebody else. That would be an example of criminally negligent homicide. And I think the Manhattan DA's office came to that conclusion. I could talk more about why it is, or why I can assume that they asked the judge at some point during deliberations to dismiss the top charge. But I will wait till till you come around to me again.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we're going to want to get into as this conversation develops. Nicole, I want to turn to you next because I think you've probably been the single most prominent voice in the conversation about the centrality of a functional and orderly subway system to the health of New York City. But over the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, it's no secret the subway system has really seen a downturn in public safety and public order. We have seen a really marked increase in the number of homicides. So while some court watchers outside of New York City might have viewed this case kind of in isolation or as separate and apart from that broader discussion, I wonder if you could just contextualize this incident from the perspective of a New Yorker in light of all the other things that are going on in the subways, including some of the other cases that have involved other people suffering from serious mental illness causing harm to riders.
Yes, thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Joan. It's striking that in Penny's first interview after he was acquitted on Fox News yesterday, he said that when he came out of the military, when he started going to school in Brooklyn and started living in the East Village, he noticed a huge change in the ambiance of the subway from, I'm paraphrasing, but from being an orderly, safe place to seeming very disorderly and chaotic. And it's also striking that many of our progressive politicians and even mainstream Democratic politicians, including the mayor, have said this is mainly a perception problem. In other words, for some reason, people are perceiving things very differently than they did 5 years ago. But the perception is grounded in reality. So, sort of brief capsule history lesson. 1990, we had 26 murders on the subway. That was a record high. That was the year that Bill Bratton became the police chief of the subway system, began a regime of broken windows, preventative policing, stop the small crimes before they escalate into large crimes. And that worked. It took a couple of years, but by 1997, we were at the point where we had 1 or 2 murders every year on the subway. So from 1997 to 2019, pretty much steadily 1 or 2 murders on the subway. with a system with 2 billion riders, you weren't really going to get it any lower. Fast forward to 2020, we had 7 murders on the subway. We had, during the COVID lockdown, 3 murders in the course of just 6 weeks, including a subway motorman, Garrett Goebel, who was murdered as he was driving his train, trying to rescue other passengers in an incident caused by a mentally ill person with a long history in both mental health and criminal justice system. So that started a very bad pattern that has continued, where 7 murders in 2020, another 7 in 2021, 11 in 2022, 6 last year, and so far this year, 10. So 5-fold increase in the number of murders on the subway, mostly random, unprovoked murders, stranger on stranger. So these are the types of crimes that people are understandably afraid of. Add to that the general felony situation, the rate per ride of violent felonies is twice what it was in the pre-COVID period. So this is a reality problem. It is not a perception problem, and this is part of the environment that Penny stepped into on May 1st, 2024, or May 1st, 2023.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I think really key to how this case was really understood, particularly by New Yorkers, and I suspect by members of the jury. Um, you know, Anyone who lives in New York and rides the subway on a regular basis has had at least one, if not one experience, at least one experience a month, probably,
And we
where they
actually,
run into someone like this.
you brought up the jury. During jury selection, as Olivia can attest, they interviewed hundreds of potential jurors. It was almost universal that every potential juror had seen a violent outburst on the subway. Most of the jurors who were chosen had seen a violent outburst, and quite a few of them had been the victim themselves of either a threat or harassment. So the idea of, you normally would not want people hearing the case who have experienced this type of behavior themselves, but that proved to be impossible to do.
I mean, yeah, that really is astounding, right? Because if you are the prosecution there, right, my guess is you're going to want to strike jurors who have, expressed that they have been on the receiving end of, a violent outburst by a seemingly mentally unwell person in the subway system. And yet, despite the juror pool being, kind of this random selection or random slice of New Yorkers, it seemed very clear from a statistical standpoint that it was going to be impossible to impanel a jury without anybody who's had those experiences, which I think has to have had some kind of impact in terms of the broader jury's understanding of this case. Olivia, you have done really just fantastic work. I think the Free Press has really done just outstanding things in terms of its coverage of this case. One of the pieces of reporting that really caught my eye recently was the compilation of video evidence that you had put together, which included body cam footage from the NYPD officers that responded to the scene, as well as footage from Daniel Penny's interrogation, which, if I'm not mistaken, took place before Daniel Penny was even made aware that Jordan Neely had passed on. Which I just found really, really interesting and somewhat troubling. But one of the many things that really stood out to me from that video package, and for those of you who haven't seen it after this conversation, I really encourage you to go ahead and take a look at it. But one of the things that really stood out to me was that some of the most ardent defenders of Daniel Penny in those moments immediately following the interaction on May 1st, 2023, were Black. I'm talking about what I saw from the body cam footage, and yet despite that reality, this case was very quickly filtered through the lens of racial politics in the media and in the broader public debate. I want to ask what was your sense of sort of how or whether the racial tensions played a role in the trial as it played out, as someone who was in the courtroom every day.
So Daniel Penny was not being tried for a hate crime, but if you just read all of the coverage about this case, especially when it first happened, you might not have realized that because within a few days, people are taking over subway platforms, chanting things like "Homeless Lives Matter," "Justice for Jordan Neely." AOC almost instantly refers to Daniel Penny as a murderer, which is a charge he never ends up facing. Jamal Bowman says this is another Black man publicly executed. A New York State senator calls this a lynching. And so this was no doubt seen in racial terms. And sometimes that did seep into the courtroom. So there were a few times in which the lead prosecutor referred to Daniel Penny as the white man, which is descriptive, but obviously has a certain implication that he was acting out of bias. And the verdict is obviously a resounding rebuke of the progressive orthodoxy that Daniel Penny was acting out of bigotry. These are 12 average, everyday New Yorkers. As Nicole mentioned, these are people who either ride the subway every day, but at least occasionally. And despite the media's best efforts to make this about race, for them, they were like, no, this is about crime, and we have had enough.
Yeah, really. I mean, it was interesting to watch because I wasn't really sure what to expect from the sort of deliberation process. I didn't know if it would play out quickly. I didn't know, if they would come back unanimous with the verdict or if they would hang. And I was kind of biting my nails through it. But I was sort of surprised that it took as long as it did for the jury to ultimately come to a decision in this case. And I think a lot of people who were sort of watching this case from the outside, kind of the more casual observer, they were, I think, a little thrown by a couple of things. I mean, the Friday before the not guilty verdict came down, the jury seemed to have been hung on the manslaughter charge. They reported to the judge, I think, twice that day that they couldn't come to a decision. And yet when they come back on Monday, it's a quick not guilty, which is interesting. And Joe, maybe you can, sort of shed some light on this, right? Because if you think about the elements of the offenses that were remaining, it seems like the main difference between the manslaughter charge and the criminally negligent homicide charge is the mens rea component, right? The sort of the standard with respect to the state of mind of the defendant, right? Were they negligent or were they reckless? Why is it, how could it be that a jury that was hung on the manslaughter charge could so quickly come back with a not guilty verdict? Is it that the doubt was on cause of death and, a lone juror was finally convinced to join the rest? Or is there some difference in the charges that makes the criminally negligent manslaughter charge easier to come to a decision on versus the manslaughter?
Well, Ralph, as you know, I have been on the bad end of long deliberations. So I understand completely how that goes and how frustrating it is when something seems clear to the public and the jury is really struggling with it. I think, number one, I think it's great when juries take a very long time to debate and discuss and come to a just conclusion because there's, one person's life is done and the other person's life is ruined for all intent and purposes. And so it's a serious matter. I think for the jury, what happened in criminally negligent homicide, once the manslaughter was dismissed, the criminally negligent homicide, to me, came down to a reasonable man theory. Would a reasonable person in his circumstance have at some point realized the risk that he was subjecting Mr. Neely to in terms of killing him? And I think for all of us, or for many people, and then ultimately the jury, Mr. Penny was seen as reasonable in that he felt like he was protecting others on the train and felt like he was holding him long enough to eliminate that risk to the other passengers. at some point, I know that there was testimony regarding a man telling him, look, he's defecating himself. He is urinating on himself and defecating himself, which is a telltale sign medically of asphyxiation and particularly neck compression. And so at that point, shortly thereafter, Mr. Penny releases Mr. Neely, and of course, it was too late. Now, of course, we believe the medical examiner. I don't think that there's any question that a medical examiner comes into this and is very thoughtful about their conclusions. And so when she said that the cause of death was asphyxiation and neck compression, I think we should all credit that. Did the drugs on board, though, cause the asphyxiation to happen more rapidly? May be an issue. Maybe someone else, a healthy person without drugs on board, maybe wouldn't have succumbed to death immediately or as quickly as Mr. Neely did. But it doesn't change the rubric for Mr. Penny, who was believing he was holding him for as long as was necessary to eliminate the risk. And that, I think, is what the jury ultimately came to the conclusion and credited him with it. A lot of people criticized the Manhattan DA's office for dismissing the manslaughter charge. And I don't know that we could second guess it, except to say that they didn't have any information about why the jury was deadlocked on that charge. I don't know that anything in the jury's questions up until that point really clued them into why it was that they were deadlocked on the manslaughter charge. But I think the Manhattan DA's office was feeling and believing that if the manslaughter charge was not there, then it would almost invite the jury to consider and to find Mr. Penny guilty of the criminally negligent homicide. Is that a compromise verdict? Perhaps. That's often the way, juries' deliberations comes out. Is it appropriate to ask the jury to compromise? No, they have to find them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of each and every element of the crime that they are. But the Manhattan DA's office thought that they were making the jury's life and the decision a little bit easier. But I think that they were missing something. I think they were missing the fact that the juries credited the accounts of all of those strap hangers who said that Mr. Penny saved the day. And that the reasonableness by which he was acting seemed appropriate to them. And after all, right, it's a jury of your peers. It's a jury of strap hangers. And when people are able to then feel that they're getting home safely because of what Daniel Penny did, then that seems completely reasonable to the people who were there and whose lives hung in the balance. And so, the fact that Mr. Neely was mentally ill is a very sad comment. I want to say that I have had many situations and many cases involving some mentally ill people. Mental illness does not cause someone to be violent.
Right.
Violent people who are mentally ill can become dangerous, but it's not their mental illness. There are many, many perfectly law-abiding citizens walking around each and every day struggling with mental illness. They are treated, they monitor their progression, they are mindful of their triggers, and they function perfectly in society. However, when a mentally ill person who has who is violent does not get treated, then you have a situation where others are at risk.
That's an important distinction. I'm glad you drew it. And there's I want to sort of pick up on the sentiment of the strap hanger. But before I do, I just want to ask very quickly, because I think this is a question that's on a lot of people's mind. Do you think it's possible that the Manhattan DA's decision to withdraw the top charge, apparently with the hopes of inducing the jury to compromise and come back and convict on the lesser charge, do you think it's possible that that just didn't sit well with the jury, that it backfired with the jury, that it made them feel like, okay, this is the kind of case where they want to get him by any means necessary, and where there might have been some inkling of unfairness that really cemented it for some people?
That is always possible. There's a theory called jury nullification. And basically what that means is that the jury, as members of the community, at some point feel that something is overall unfair. And that people are proceeding perhaps on a theory um, to or desire to get a result without perhaps thinking about the fact that the jurors taking this very, very seriously and that they are really parsing out this mens rea and they want to be absolutely sure about what they're doing. I also think, though, Ralph, there is something about Friday into Monday, and I'll explain that. Years ago, many jurors were sequestered. In murder cases, it was routine to be sequestered. That ended many years ago, but many years ago, that's what happened. And it was seen at some point as pressure inducing to the jury
Right.
because they couldn't go home, they couldn't continue their lives until a decision was made. And it was thought of as like sort of putting the thumb on the jury in a way
Yeah.
to come to a decision and come to it quickly.
No, it makes
Since
sense.
it's almost virtually eliminated in the rarest of all circumstances, I think that people go home to their lives and they decompress. They clear their heads like we all do with any major decision. And they
Sure.
oftentimes come back with a decision that is more thoughtful and more common sense oriented. So I do think that it's a positive thing to let people go home, to let people decompress, not talk about the case, of course,
Sure.
but just sort of clear their heads and come back and sort of rationally analyze what's left.
Well, I really do wonder about, this sort of sense that not just the people on the jury, but, the people in the courtroom and in the city writ large, listening to the witness accounts, understanding the details of this case in the context of their own personal experiences, and Nicole, I want to go to you on this because one of the things that you've written about is this idea of eyes on the street, and safety in numbers. But there's really only safety in numbers if the people around you are actually going to step up and help in this situation, right? I mean, there's no safety in numbers if everyone around you has pre-committed to stand down in a moment in which someone needs defense. And there's been this kind of debate that's ongoing in the city and in the media around this case where, was this Penny's responsibility? Was this the city's failure? I mean, is there just a reality that some of the people on this jury saw themselves in Daniel Penny and thought, well, gosh, I would want someone to do that for me, or I might decide to do that for someone else. And I'm not sure that it's right that I would find myself in legal jeopardy for that.
Yes, I think the prosecution started off being arrogant toward a Manhattan jury and thinking, remember, this trial started before the election, in thinking that a Manhattan jury is going to see Penny as a vigilante and also associate him with the Trump movement. I mean, there was this sort of undercurrent that he's from Long Island, that the prosecution tried to impugn his character witnesses by sort of implying that these were the type of people who would have participated in the January 6th riot, in particularly with one character witness. This was a former Marine, lives in Alabama now. He had written on Facebook last year that he wanted to organize a motorcycle ride to New York to protest Penny being indicted, and the prosecutor brought that up. I think that might have backfired on the jury. I mean, I think there's kind of a stance of let the guy have his character witnesses, and this should be a non-controversial point in the trial. So I don't think that went over very well with him. And I think there's two other places where the prosecutor made mistakes that were born out of arrogance. One, Joan had mentioned that there was no question over the cause of death. I think there actually was. The prosecutor seemed to want to position the medical examiner, Dr. Cynthia Harris, as a star witness. They had her on the stand for 2 days, and then she went through cross-examination, so it was closer to 3 days. They could have gone through her testimony much more quickly and been much more pointed about it, but I think they wanted her to be the big star of this show, that her testimony would be so overwhelming that the jury would have no choice but to convict. And I think that actually went over poorly when the defense brought up their own forensic pathologist, Dr. Chandru. He poked some holes in the prosecutor's theory, in the medical examiner's cause of death. We went through a lot of complex issues over sickle cell trait and whether this could have been the mechanism through which asphyxia happened. And Dr. Harris, after days and days of saying that was not possible, she finally said, yes, it was possible. I think that made an impression on the jury because the jury actually wanted that testimony read back. And in the note asking for it to be read back, the jury said, we want to hear where Dr. Harris admits that she didn't have all of the facts. And in fact, she had never said that in those words, but the fact that that's how they remembered it and paraphrased it on that day before they deadlocked in asking for that testimony back really shows a lot about their state of mind over the cause of death. And I also think dropping that manslaughter charge, the second-degree manslaughter, something that apparently has never been done at this point in the trial where the jury had already been negotiating for 2.5 days. If you were a juror, you heard all these questions from the prosecutor during voir dire. Can you convict on manslaughter? This is a serious thing. You have to be able to say, yes, I can do this if it is proven. And then again, during the closing arguments, this is going to be hard for you to do, but there's a reason that we charged manslaughter. It is because society cannot accept this behavior. So to say we brought this charge because this is a grave situation, then to go back with that and then deliberate for 2.5 days and then say, okay, we're deadlocked. And then, moments later, we're going to drop that charge. I mean, they heard it from the judge,
Right.
but it must have seemed very strange. Was the court taking this charge seriously or were they not? I mean, the jury certainly took it seriously. If the prosecution had taken it seriously, they would have gone ahead with a mistrial and retried the case. So the fact that that didn't happen, particularly with 2 lawyers on the jury, must have seemed very, very strange and maybe an indication that the jury is taking this more seriously than the prosecutor or the court and may have had something to do with the not guilty verdict after the weekend.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that's a reasonable conjecture there. Olivia, there are a couple things that I really want to ask you about. One of the things that was really interesting to me, just as a sort of casual observer, of the trial playing out. I mean, I've obviously paid very close attention to this case, but I was not in the courtroom every day. But one of the things that really jumped out at me was a very small clip from the body cam footage where an NYPD officer seems to indicate that Jordan Neely was still breathing after he had already been released by Daniel Penny. Did that seem to feature prominently in the trial? Do you think that had anything to do with sort of why the jury had such a difficult time reaching a choice or a verdict in this case?
I am not sure. So the prosecution, I believe it was the medical examiner who actually had a pretty compelling argument as to why first responders were able to detect a heartbeat or a pulse on Jordan Neely upon arrival. And that is because even after brain death,
Right.
The heart can continue to pump blood. And so I'm not sure. I think that they did request evidence. The jury requested to see elements of the body cam footage again, so they might have been considering that, but I think that they were focusing more on was it reasonable for Daniel Penny to feel like he or other passengers were in immediate danger? Was it reasonable for him to act? I think, of course they focused a little bit on parsing, what actually did kill Jordan Neely? How did K2 factor into this? How could schizophrenia or sickle cell crisis have factored into this too? But I think that based on the arguments we saw, they were probably mulling more whether or not, he had a right to intervene and whether he took that too far.
Yeah, I just want to note really quickly before we continue our discussion that we're starting to see some questions coming from the audience. So those of you out there who are watching, please feel free to throw your questions into the chat, and I will try my best to get to as many of them as I can before our time runs out. But Olivia, I want to go back to you because just sticking on the theme of, sort of the importance of video evidence. When I first heard about the Daniel Penny case, one of the things that came to my mind almost immediately was another viral social media video. It took place on New York City subways, and it involved a seemingly homeless, clearly mentally unwell man kind of walking up and down a subway car, yelling things incoherently, acting menacing. And at one point in this video, he walks up to a young woman who's, riding the train, grabs her by the hair, stands her up, walks her over to one end of the train, sits her down next to him. And you can tell that this woman is petrified. I mean, she's holding back tears. She's shaking with fear. And I remember that the overwhelming response on social media to that video was that, well, why aren't any of the men on that train doing anything? How, that was like the most common commentary was how despicable all the other men were for not getting up in her defense. Now, ultimately, I think she was eventually let go without any, real injuries. But, that seems to be luck. Kind of going back to this whole idea of like eyes on the street, J. Meyer being, sort of central to how we all function in a city this big where cops can't be everywhere all at once. What does it mean? What does this case mean, do you think, for daily life in New York where, people who are mentally unwell are going to be among us. They're going to be on the subways. They're going to be in public. Just a couple of weeks ago, someone who was very mentally ill and had a long criminal history stabbed 3 New Yorkers to death. What do you think this means for the future of urban life, particularly here in New York?
Part of me wonders if Daniel Penny intervened because it's my understanding he had lived in New York City for maybe, a couple months at that point. He's from West Islip, Long Island, which is a really idyllic, surfing beach town, very family oriented. And so part of me wonders if Daniel Penny intervened, not only, he has Marine training and probably a real sense of duty, but I also think he was like, wait, what is going on? Like, I think all of us the witnesses have said this was exceptional and it seemed like violence was imminent. But I also think a part of him was just like, wait, people accept this? I just don't think he was as adjusted to how normal that has become. And that is one of the most upsetting things as a New Yorker, about subway culture is I remember moving here, within a week. It actually hasn't happened since, but it took 1 week. And there was someone fully masturbating on the train.
Wow.
And I remember looking around, like I was like Daniel Penny in that sense, where I was like, wait, this is not right. And I remember looking around and looking at men who they were all pretending like there was an alternate explanation for what was going on, like just on their phones. And anyway, I don't know. I don't quite know the impact that this will have. I hope, as someone who watched this trial, it did make me fearful personally about the liability potentially intervening. And, what if you perform the Heimlich on someone, but you do it incorrectly, and like
Right.
the potential consequences for attempting to be a good Samaritan. So anyway, at the very least, hopefully this shows New Yorkers that other New Yorkers get it and they are riding those subway cars. They see those things and maybe they don't look at you, but in their hearts, they're like, this is not right. This can't go on like this.
Yeah, I mean, so the question about what this means for New York is one question, but this case took on kind of national prominence, I think, and I do think it's interesting that this verdict comes down the way that it did in the wake of a national election that really saw a shift to the right, particularly in urban America. New York is not the only city dealing with public order issues. Los Angeles, Oakland, Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, Chicago, lots of cities across the country have been dealing with similar issues. Given the response to the Penny trial, Nicole, I want to go to you on this. I mean, does it seem reasonable that we've kind of hit a moment in our politics where there's just less of a tolerance for the kind of lawlessness that might have been characterizing urban life in the minds of other Americans?
Yes, I think there's less tolerance in that in 2020 and 2021 and even into early 2022, the response from the New York City progressives and the New York City transit advocates about this rising subway crime and rising crime in general in New York was, it's just your imagination, it's just anecdotes. This is being ginned up for political reasons. And then even after the facts couldn't be denied anymore, when we had a couple of years worth of consistently higher subway crime, the argument began, well, more people are killed by cars, okay, 10 people got killed on the subway this year, but that's still not a lot of people. I mean, we just had these ridiculous arguments. And I think even among the progressives and the transit advocates, there was a realization that we can't continue to make these arguments. We're just going to lose people, especially after the killing of Michelle Go on the subway. I mean, keep in mind, we had already had 14 post-COVID subway killings by the time Michelle Go was killed in January 2022. Hers wasn't even the first subway murder of the year. We had a man pushed on the tracks in the Bronx on early New Year's Day and killed. But after Michelle Go, the Deloitte worker who was pushed in Times Square by a person who had spent time in state prison, who had a parole violation, so shouldn't have been out on the subways, things changed, and that even the progressives knew they couldn't ignore it. Then they started to switch to, okay, well, we have to use the mental health system to get people the help they need. I think most people agree with that, but people are starting to say, you want to use the mental health system, fine, but you have to do it competently. It's not an excuse to say this person was mentally ill, he doesn't belong in the criminal justice system. If he doesn't belong in the criminal justice system, he doesn't belong out on the street. And I think that's where we are now, in that certainly both Neely, one of the things we saw during the trial was his hospital records, where his doctors wanted him in restraints because he was dangerous, but still he was let out over and over and over again. He walked away from residential treatment, but the warrant for his arrest after that was never acted upon, even though he was in plain sight on the subway. And of course, just weeks ago, Rivera, the person who stabbed the 3 strangers in Manhattan, same thing. He walked away from a supervised release, and they didn't go and get him. So if you want to use the mental health system, you've got to do it much more competently than you're doing it right now.
Yeah, that's actually really an important point, because I have found that in the discourse in the wake of this verdict, what you've gotten from a lot of progressive critics of the verdict is this idea that, really the city's to blame here because Jordan Neely didn't have the resources that he needed, right? All he needed was stable housing and access to food, and none of this would have happened, right? He was hungry. That's why he was upset. And what that ignores is the reality that as part of the legal settlement for the 2021 case, the plea deal, he was actually given stable housing access, a place where he would get square meals. And God knows that there's no shortage of, soup kitchens and other sources of help for the needy in New York City. But he walked away from that facility after, I think, just 13 days. Is there a misunderstanding on the public's part with respect to the infrastructure that's already in place to help people who are suffering from mental health crises?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Neely was, as you said, he had severely injured somebody. Part of his plea bargain that was settled with the Manhattan DA was he had to participate in a pretty uh, uh, rigorous, high intensity residential program. And once he walked away from that, there was really no effort to go and execute the warrant that subsequently was put out for his arrest. That was an outstanding warrant at the time of May 1st, 2023. And again, just weeks ago with Ramon Rivera, same thing. Walked away from supervised release. No real interest in where he is until he shows up, stabbing 3 people randomly to death on the city streets. And these are not anecdotes. I mean, we can give you multiple. You are aware yourself of many of these incidents through your own work at the Manhattan Institute. So when we look at an increase in Manhattan murders of 80% relative to the 2015 to 2019 annual average. These are the laws of not very high numbers, thankfully. So if you want to get them back down, you actually have to look at each of these incidents and see what went wrong. Why wasn't this prevented? And this is why.
Yeah. Yeah, Joan, I mean, at the beginning of our conversation, you made a really good point and drew an important distinction, I thought, which was that, there are lots of people who struggle with some of the same kinds of diagnoses that we see in the individuals responsible for some of these heinous crimes. And the vast majority of them are not violent, right? I mean, it's not an inherently violent condition to suffer from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder necessarily. But violent people who do have these conditions are significantly higher risks to the broader public safety. And, there is a sense in which I wonder whether, it's time for us to finally have a conversation about the reality that some people are just not amenable to the kind of change that I think a lot of advocates hope for when they connect individuals who are suffering and coming in and out of contact with the criminal justice system with these services and with these resources. In your experience as a prosecutor, I mean, what have you seen? I mean, how often is just connecting someone who is in this kind of high risk pool of people who are both violent and suffering from these mental health disorders? How confident should the public be that simply connecting someone like Jordan Neely with services is likely to solve the sort of problems that we're hoping to mitigate?
Ralph, it's a very, very difficult situation because people with mental illness oftentimes do not view themselves as having
Right.
mental illness. It's very, very difficult to convince somebody who's mentally ill that, in fact, what they're experiencing is not reality and that they're mentally ill. Now, add to that somebody who is, by their own nature, antisocial or violent. Those people are particularly difficult because they're not only going to have difficulty in accepting the fact that they're mentally ill, but they also don't care. They're antisocial, so that they're going to, strike out on their own agenda, irrespective of whether or not it at times will then affect the rest of society, right? Someone who commits robberies over and over and over again, they put themselves above the interests of society. And that's no different with mentally ill people. They will put themselves over the interests of society, even knowing that they have these tendencies because they're not accepting their mental illness. And at the end of the day, they don't care. And I can't say that this was Mr. Neely. I mean, there are many people as well who really fall through the cracks of the system and who do not have, the mental or intelligent wherewithal to be able to, sort of organize their lives in a way that would help them and help them sort of fit in terms of having a productive and a happy life. But when you have somebody who is already violent, who is already antisocial, it becomes very, very difficult to convince them they have mental illness and to get the treatment they need. And we're just not doing well. We're just not,
Yeah.
as a society, we're not doing well with our mentally ill.
No, I agree. And I think that's one of the reasons why this case has been so divisive, right? It's divided New Yorkers, it's divided Americans. And Joan, I want to stick with you here because I suspect that it has likely divided the Manhattan DA's office. And, there's an election coming up for the Manhattan DA. But I mean, that's the question, right? Does a case like this spark the same kinds of debates in an office like the Manhattan DA's office? We just recently saw a Manhattan assistant district attorney robbed, I believe, in her home. It's not as if they're not living in the same city. It's not as if they're not riding the same subways. It's not as if they're not having the same kinds of experiences. I mean, did Alvin Bragg take a risk here with respect to potentially sowing discord among the rank and file prosecutors under him?
Ralph, I think that it's a very difficult situation in that Alvin Bragg no doubt has his own set of um, um, correctness in that he feels as though certain changes have to be made at the Manhattan DA's office. And I'm sure not everybody in the office agreed. I'm sure some of the changes were well received, others perhaps not. I don't know that this is the product of just one person or just one assistant DA or just Alvin Bragg's notion of this. I'm sure that there was meetings and there may have been other people in the office who agreed. But I think that hindsight is 2020. We all now think that it was ill-advised. And look, a prosecutor, the last thing a prosecutor wants to do is put somebody in jail. That's the inevitable for somebody who cannot function in society, and we have an obligation to protect the rest of society from somebody who's not functioning well. But as a prosecutor, we're also not just prosecutors. In a way, we've become and we've been drawn towards social work, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because prevention of crime is also the mission of a prosecutor. However, our first and primary goal is to protect people in society. And we have to protect them from those people who are antisocial and who are going to harm others. And then secondary, of course, is trying to prevent that crime from happening again and prevent those people from reoffending. And that's also a noble mission. But we have to remember primary, we're the prosecutors. So we're the people who have to protect other people.
Right.
And hope that we can help people and hope that people won't offend. But there are some people who have to be separated out of society because they're going to harm other people.
Yeah, no, I do think
Yeah.
I think that's the crucial point here. And that's, at least to my mind, has always been the sort of primary end that the criminal justice system serves, is this, ability to exercise government authority to incapacitate people who pose a risk to society writ large. The question is there a basis for confidence that that's the message that New York City and maybe the rest of the country is going to get from this case, Olivia? I mean, do we think that anything has been learned here by the people in a position to actually make policy changes? I mean, is the next Jordan Neely less likely to happen because he's more likely to be in a facility where he's compelled to be, where he's going to get the care and medication that he needs? Or are we just going to continue rolling the dice and hope that this is just, one of these rare things that happens every couple of years?
I think this does have the potential to, I think it's possible that lawmakers, people in the DA's office, in their hearts, that they still want to push for criminal justice reform and decriminalization policies. But I think that this sends a clear message that there's very little appetite there amongst just everyday people, even in New York, in Manhattan, a county that Harris won by 65 points. The red wave came for this jury. They are not elected officials. They're just everyday people, just making a decision in part based on what they see in their everyday lives. And I think that this has to speak clearly just to the fact that, I think that this is a huge referendum on the progressive policies of Alvin Bragg. And I think that going forward, legislators are going to be a lot more careful, or maybe the DA's office will be more careful too, when they create policies that continue to add chaos in our cities.
Yeah, I mean, the politics of this, particularly for Bragg, are interesting, right? Because this isn't the first prosecution where a New Yorker has exercised their ability to defend themselves and found themselves in the bad end of a prosecution. Nicole, I just want to go to you here. I mean, do you think that this is ultimately going to spark a sort of change in culture? Because I do think some people don't quite get how a DA who ran on a platform of decriminalization, of decarceration, of not prosecuting more cases and using jail and prison as a last resort, yet has a record of going after with a good bit of ferocity people with no criminal histories, people who don't have the kind of risk factors on that checklist that we might look at. They're not severely mentally ill. They are full-time employed. They have families. They, again, don't have criminal histories. How do you reconcile those two patterns, right? How do you reconcile the fact that the prosecution of Daniel Penny comes from an office that has really made it a point to not prosecute other people who we have every reason to believe have committed the crimes that they were alleged to have committed, but have nevertheless been diverted out of the system?
Yes, I think it is a reasonable inference that this was a well-educated jury. Most of them reported relying on some credible New York City news source during the voir dire. They paid some attention to what's going on. They were likely familiar with Bragg's general philosophy, if not all of the details of that philosophy. So, especially when the prosecutor, Daphne Uran, said during the closing statements that maybe the judge wouldn't even give Penny any prison time, that was very strange because I guess she's not supposed to say that, as the defense later brought up after the jury was gone. But even if the jury didn't know that she wasn't supposed to say that, it's again the mixed messages, the same with dropping the manslaughter crime that we've been hearing now for 6 weeks during all of the opening statements and the closing statements, the testimony that was elicited by the prosecutor, that this was just such a terrible thing that Penny did, that we have to have this manslaughter charge. And then all of a sudden at the end to say, oh, by the way, he might not even get any jail time. It was kind of a very mixed message. I have no idea why the camera went out. It says that the camera has been unplugged, but hopefully people know what I look like by now.
Yeah, I
Nicole,
think we've got it.
I was just going to interject, Ralph, that Nicole is absolutely correct, and that one of the things that we tell jurors every time is they are not to consider in any way sentencing or punishment in any matter. And so bringing that up is not an appropriate thing. And I don't know if it was in an effort to get a jury to rally around the charges or not, but we generally don't do that. And I think, probably the prosecutor just misspoke and just was sort of, in speaking and in giving her summation, her opening statements, misspoke in a way that probably wasn't appropriate. And it's irrelevant, right, in a way, in this particular case, because you hear such serious charges, and whether or not we're sending Daniel Penny to jail, his life was going to be, in essence, ruined over this. Anybody's life would be. So it was going to be that serious and that heartbreaking for both families, no matter whether or not he was sentenced to jail. That would be, of course, beyond devastating, but it still was devastating in just having the charge.
Yeah, no, I think those are really, really astute points. So look, I'm a pessimist on a lot of things in life, but I do have a bright side, and that side tends to hold out hope that episodes like this one teach us lessons that we can then take from and apply in our lives to make the world a better place. I have been troubled by the fact that you haven't seen a lot of public officials here in New York or in the country more broadly kind of come out with more serious proposals about how to prevent the next Jordan Neely, about how to ensure that people who can't take care of themselves have a place where they can be, even against their will, but where they can be safe and where other people can be safe from them. What is it that you all hope to see, if anything, to come out of this case? And are you confident that we're going to see something? And I'll start with you, Nicole.
I hope to see, and I think we are already seeing, an understanding on the part of Manhattan elected officials and city elected officials that you cannot explain away this crime by saying it's just we have to fix the root causes in society and there's nothing we can do about it until we fix those things. The prosecutor also kind of hinted at that when she said all Jordan Neely was doing was demanding to be seen. I don't think the jury bought that. I think they saw him as a real credible threat. I think the elected political class is starting to absorb. New Yorkers know they didn't accept this level of random violence for almost 3 decades, and we don't have to go back to accepting it now.
Yeah, Olivia, I'll turn to you next with the same question. I mean, what are you hoping for?
I hope that the political class just is distraught right now. I hope that they are really grappling with this because in the days after this happened, there were a lot of quotes from people like AOC saying, kind of blaming Daniel Penny and subway riders for feeling uncomfortable when really it was not a feeling of discomfort, it was a feeling of immediate physical fear. And there was a lot of armchair experting going on of people saying, oh, well, I've lived in this city for this long, and when this happens, you just move to the next subway car. I hope that attitude, we don't see it anymore, that the emphasis is no longer put on the average subway rider. I hope that the political class, especially in New York, understands that this is not a problem of tolerance. This is a problem of crime and that the fear is legitimate. So I just hope that they take these complaints about the subway, the kind of things that Nicole was describing, the disorder, I hope that they take it seriously and stop dismissing it as bias.
And Joan, I'll go to you for the last word in our last minute here.
So I would like to see 2 things. Number one, I would like to see people thinking about taking action to help their fellow New Yorkers versus just taking out their phones and filming. And the other thing I would love to see is an appreciation for law enforcement, because those are the people who every day have to be the ones that are taking that action. And it's wonderful and it's great when a regular, civilian does that, puts themselves out there. I think that this was a chilling effect for anybody, irrespective of the fact that the case was it resulted in an acquittal. I think it's a chilling effect to see what happens to people who put themselves out there. But I would hope that people understand and appreciate the fact that when you see a police officer on the subway, on a subway platform, on a bus, on the street, that you accommodate and respect them as much as possible, because they're the people who are going to be standing between you and harm's way.
Well, Joan, Nicole, Olivia, thank you so much for joining us for this wonderful conversation. All of you out there listening and watching, thank you for joining us for this virtual conversation. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider checking out the rest of the Manhattan Institute's work at manhattan.institute, and also considering supporting that work as we come to the new year. Thank you all and happy holidays.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Bye, everyone.